Hi, everyone. I hope you've had a really good, productive day so far. Firstly, I wanted to thank PCS Alma for this lovely opportunity to share my insights. I have to say, I have to admit, this is the first time I'm doing a webinar, so please bear with me on that. And also, I wanted to thank my colleagues from NatWest Markets Technology and also Internal Audit, who have helped me, continuously learn and develop my own skills. So just to quickly introduce myself, I am the global head of electronic trading and NatWest technology at NatWest Markets, a role I've been doing for more than a year now. Prior to that, I've been in several internal audit functions in the financial services industry, mainly investment banking roles. I have also done a stint in the first line, implementing electronic trading controls for MiFID II implementation. I started off my career as an application developer. That was many, many years ago now in India. And I have also worked in 3 out of the big 4, mainly kind of doing risk and advisory, technology risk advisory and assurance type services. So in terms of the agenda for today's session, what I would plan to do is to take you through some key definitions before we then explore some of the key risks and barriers when enterprises embark on their journey to migrate to public cloud. And then I would like to highlight some key controls and countermeasures that organizations would be able to use to migrate to cloud in a safe and secure way. I will also try to leave ample time for questions at the end of my session, and I am hoping to hear from all of you in terms of questions and Q&A or any other insights that you want to share as well in the end. And thank you to the audience for taking time out of your busy evenings to listen to this presentation. In terms of, just to set the scene, almost every company has recognized the need to take on a digital transformation journey. To harness digital technologies like cloud computing to achieve better customer outcomes and hence generate organizational value. Now, the stakes couldn't be higher, I would say, and hence, there is a big move to accelerate digital maturity so that the companies can build a sustained competitive advantage. Now, before I take you through the key challenges and barriers that organizations face while migrating to public cloud, I would like to take you through some key definitions in order to set the stage. Before labeling any service as a cloud service, it must adhere to some essential characteristics. And that is so the bit that I'm talking about is the last box there with the 5 essential characteristics. One is on-demand self-service, where additional computing resources such as processing power or network storage can be automatically provisioned as needed, just with a click of a button. It should have broad network access where the cloud can be accessed from anywhere, any device, over the internet, on your smartphone. There should also be resource pooling. So what I mean by that is the CSP's computing resources are usually pooled to service multiple customers using, usually a typical multi-tenant model with different physical and virtual resources dynamically assigned and reassigned according to demand. There is a sense of, kind of almost location independence, and the client generally doesn't know where that data is hosted or the exact location of, say, the data center or the hosting location of the cloud provider. So another key thing that I would like to say is that examples of these computing resources that I'm talking about include storage, it includes processing power, it includes memory, network bandwidth, and also virtual machines. The fourth point is around rapid elasticity. Now, what I mean by that is capabilities can either be rapidly scaled up or scaled down and elastically provisioned to accommodate the customer's needs. To the customers, the capabilities available for provisioning often appear to be unlimited, and it can be purchased in any quantity at any time. The last point is it is a pay-as-you-go service. It is a measured service because the resource usage of that particular consumer using the cloud provider's computing resources can be monitored, it can be controlled, it can be reported. And actually, this is a big advantage for many enterprise IT functions, because this is something that helps them provide transparency around IT costs, about how much exactly it costs to run these services on the cloud. Cloud can also be serviced and configured and selected based on different setups and different needs. And I want to take you through the key kind of service models that are typically used. I have audio.
Sorry, Shri, just can I just disturb you on that, because you just mentioned about the cloud characteristic, right? Like what would be the best things, what people should look at. Can you maybe, before you go to the models, can you just say maybe from your experience, like what would be like the tips and tricks, or what you would look after? Like, for example, you said about the rapid elasticity, like what does it mean? Like if we need all of a sudden more, I don't know, 2 terabytes of the of the data, like, can you just maybe elaborate a little bit more of your experience, what to look for, what is the tips and tricks when you are deciding? Because I think a lot of people don't know, and I will be one of them, how actually you can decide what is the characteristic, how you can score it. Do you put it like in the score or something like that? Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more of the details? And I don't mean to put you on the spot right now. It just
I think, thank you for that question, Susanna. I think what I would like to say is that, if I put in very layman terms, I'm a user, who runs, a big, risk compute engine. I would probably lean my examples more towards the financial services industry, because that's where, I've worked largely over my career. So this is, I would give an example of a risk engine, which typically uses a lot of power, and it has these, kind of, almost like huge, terabytes of storage and computing power to be able to run those risk calculations. And what happens is that these risk calculations, happen overnight at specific sets, over batches, batch processes. And what happens is that it needs that power only when it's running the calculations, but it's not really requiring the power during the day when the trades are still happening, when the market hours are still on. So I think with rapid elasticity, it gives the technology teams the ability to say, actually, I'm not even going to put my VM, I'm not even going to turn on my VM during the AM hours or when risk is not being calculated. I'm going to use that computing power, on maybe another thing that is really critical for that point, which is potentially something like trade settlements or something which needs to continuously happen. So I think it gives the optionality for a technology team to then decide where they want to use that very, almost like expensive piece of computing equipment. Where would they want to put that? And that is what rapid elasticity gives you. I think what they would also see is quite a few almost like traffic light systems, where they will see that I'm putting all of my compute power of the cloud for this particular application because I want to, that is my main focus at this particular point in time. And they can configure it and use it the way they want. And of course, I may be simplifying it, heavily because I'm only seeing it from an audit perspective. I've never, run these types of engines on a cloud computing platform. However, I have audited it, so I kind of understand how that works. I hope that answers your question.
No, absolutely, absolutely. It's just for me, like I think between us, the cloud and all the demand, like a lot of people saying, okay, cloud is actually somebody else's computer. So when you're looking at that, it's nothing something like in the cloud or flying somewhere. It's a physical machine. It's just somewhere else, right?
Absolutely.
But it's something like how do you then make sure that you know how to get enough space, or from your audit point of the view, because the topic of this presentation is about how you can audit, how you can spot the risks, and of course it's about the environment, it's about where this cloud sits, where is it or something. But when you need extra space, do you ask these questions? Do you somehow being interested how the capacity is actually sourced by the provider or whoever you have, right?
Yeah, and I think that's something that is an important consideration for when you're having those discussions, agreeing that level of service that you're getting from the provider, and what tools they would give. There's usually typically a management console or some kind of a interface which then is provided to the IT guys to then say, here you go, you run your applications the way you need. You use the amount of resources you need within a particular, kind of course, bandwidth of how much you agreed with the cloud provider upfront. But it gives the ability to then, kind of focus on things that they want to use that computing power for. But absolutely, it is a physical thing. It's not just a fluffy thing in the sky, but it is actually there's many data centers running. A lot of these have a lot of these servers that are actually sitting physically out there in the world, dotted around the world. So Amazon Web Services have many data centers which potentially they are then getting from some other providers who are then managing the physical infrastructure for them. So it's quite a web of kind of third-party risk that gets posed because of cloud computing. So if we then move on to the cloud services service models, the one that we all know about is software as a service, which is where the consumer doesn't really have any control over anything. It is a capability which is provided to the consumer to use the provider's applications, which is running on a cloud infrastructure. So examples of these would be something like Dropbox or Salesforce. All of these are software as services where we don't really have that much control of how the application is. Maybe we might have configuration on the capability on the application front end, but that's about it. The next level of service is an infrastructure as a service where the consumer does not manage or control the underlying cloud infrastructure, but does have control over the operating systems, the storage, the deployed applications, and possibly some limited control over selected networking components like firewalls. Examples of these are like something like maybe Google Cloud Platform or Microsoft Azure Office 365. All of these fall under the bucket of infrastructure as a service. And then the third level of service, which is almost the least control that the consumer has, is the platform as a service, where the consumer does not even manage or control the underlying cloud infrastructure, which includes the networks, the servers, the operating systems, storage. He only has control over the deployed applications and some configuration settings for the application hosting environment. A very popular example of this is actually Netflix, which uses infrastructure provided by Amazon Web Services using the PaaS service model. In terms of the cloud deployments, again, there are many options that companies have. Cloud can be deployed as a public cloud provided by a vendor, accessible over the internet. It can be deployed over a private cloud, where this is more where the companies want control of their computing services and computing infrastructure. It's owned and operated on-site by a single enterprise. A community cloud is where it's a combination of, it's either a public cloud or a private cloud, but it's shared by an industry group. For example, there's a banking cloud. And also there's a hybrid cloud, which is a mixture of private and public cloud, where they want to make the best use of different cloud abilities. So those are the kind of key models when it comes to the cloud. And hopefully that sets the scene for the main kind of topic of this presentation, which is around what are the top risks and challenges when it comes to migrating to public cloud. I found some really interesting charts when I was preparing this presentation, and I think it really summarizes, some of the top risks and challenges that companies face. And this is from a January 2019 report where a company called RightScale Flexera surveyed IT professionals across a broad cross section of organizations about their adoption of cloud computing, and actually produced for the 8th year the State of the Cloud report. Now, it's interesting to see that the cloud cost management and governance are the top challenges for organizations. I was actually expecting to see security as the top one, but governance and cost, kind of overtook that as a top challenge. And these are also growing challenges when it compares to the 2018 report. Um, why is it so difficult for organizations to get cloud transformation right, even in the best of times? And this is something from I think as auditors, we are usually quite a cynical bunch, and we always think about, I'm sure there's a risk of going ahead with X, Y, or Z. So what is so challenging? I think the main, I would say, from our perspective, the scale of the challenge is one factor, I think. A cloud transformation journey actually touches on every part of the organization. So it's important to have the right governance structure to oversee all of the change related activities because it impacts people, processes, and technology. Now, please note that what I have listed in this slide are some of the key risks and challenges which are most common. But in the end, every cloud consuming or cloud providing organization does remain responsible for carrying out their own risk assessment. Not all risks also should receive the same level of attention. This should be based on the organization's overall risk tolerance or risk appetite. Its strategy for risk management may be to mitigate the risk through implementation of controls, transfer the risk through insurance policies, or avoidance of the risk altogether so that the risk is not even realized. So that is, just setting the scene in terms of what really is risk management. But then if we come on to what was some of why we seeing these as the top risks for cloud computing migrations. The first thing is around, the governance. Now, as stated in the RightScale report, governance is a common challenge. The most important aspect of cloud migration is related to the choices the organization makes about whether they want to go with public, private, or hybrid cloud, the selection of the cloud service provider, and the level of service they want to get from the CSP. Now, these choices should be aligned to the organization's business strategy and its high-level goals and overall risk appetite. Cloud computing, like I mentioned before, when I was answering Susanna's question, it does introduce external service providers, in some cases, many service providers. And then that's why there comes the third-party outsourcing risks. And some of these could be things like vendor lock-in, where your technology and application stack becomes too married to a particular cloud provider's tool sets, or over-reliance on the cloud service provider, which causes concentration risk and also a single point of failure. So these are some of the kind of key governance risks. When it comes to security risks, now, like I mentioned before, I think I was expecting security to be actually number one rather than number two. But security risks, I think, I would say it's not very different to the security risks cybersecurity risks that any company faces, even with a normal on-prem application. It does bring about, however, additional cybersecurity attack vectors that need to be considered, in addition to the technical and the governance risks that we spoke about. In the digital age, I would say that data is an organization's most valuable asset. It's almost like a crown jewel that needs to be protected. Now, according to Verizon's 2020 data breach investigations report, attacks targeting cloud-based data nearly doubled in 2019 compared to the year before, as companies shifted more of their valuable information off premises, and that's thus making it much more vulnerable. The report, the Verizon report also detailed that 86% of the data breaches were launched for financial gain. It was actually up from 71% in 2019. Over 80% of hacking incidents involved brute force or use of lost or stolen credentials. 67% of breaches were caused by credential theft, errors, social attacks. Less than 1 in 20 breaches exploited some type of unpatched vulnerability. Now, web application attacks on cloud-based data accounted for about 43% of all breaches in 2019, according to Verizon. Now, I would say that such attacks may become even more common this year in 2020 as a result of the work from home shift that all of us are working from home during the COVID-19 pandemic, and this has then led to a shift of applications and data more to the cloud.
Can I?
Sorry, you were saying so, Susanna.
Sorry, just to do, because you are talking about very interesting knowledge, and we have one question from anonymous person. Just for the reference, is this from your personal experience? From your organization, you are doing your audits for your organization. The question is, how far has the speaker's organization got to with the cloud implementation? Would you consider that you have implemented like the cloud across all the processes, all the environment, or is there still something like on-site reliance or dependability or something like that? Just so we understand where is it coming from. I think that the question sounds to me, it's more like understanding from implementation and the audit's finding if the company is mature enough to actually have all these things in place. So that's what I'm just suggesting that the question is.
Yeah, sure. So I think, where this is coming from in terms of what I'm speaking about right now is more kind of industry perspective. I would say though that, NatWest Group as a whole is quite mature, I would say, from a cloud, platform perspective. They use several cloud providers. They also have their own private cloud. We do conduct audits of these cloud implementations as well. And typically the way we would structure the audit is to then, we don't typically do a lot in each audit. What we would do is we would maybe focus on one risk and then do a deep dive of all of the underlying controls supporting that risk. So we just did one which was just looking at the governance of the overall cloud migration program. We also did another risk about, just looking at the perimeter controls connecting from NatWest Group into the cloud. So we do, kind of more detailed audits, just looking at how that particular risk is mitigated, because each risk could have several controls. That said, I think I would say they're quite mature in terms of, how they have gone about the migration. And I would say maybe generally across the banking industry is probably a lot more, regulated, and there's a lot more kind of eyes and ears, especially from a regulatory perspective, on these types of big transformation programs. So I think it's generally well controlled in terms of these types of big transformation projects. I hope that clarifies.
I think so. We just got some more questions. So if you're just happy just to have them since we are discussing. So Paul Smith would like to ask you a questions about how do you rationalize NatWest staff behavior contacting customers from home on home Wi-Fi, which generally it could be a liability under the ISO and security and GDPR that precludes this, such behavior. Is there anything that you would say from your auditing point of view and maybe challenges that actually some of your staff is conducting right now using not as much secure sources because you can't secure your home Wi-Fi? So do you have any opinion on this, or is it more towards your information security team? So how do you look at that? Any comment on that?
Well, actually, it's interesting because, the way we, and just generally in internal audit, we usually audit anything which is the most risky in that particular point in time. So we did actually flex our audit plan to then look at some of these really critical elements, because almost the entire workforce is working from home, and thus putting a lot of pressure on certain kind of technology capabilities like remote access, or the kind of the practices that front office staff are usually, they're the ones who the front office traders and sales, they're not allowed to work from home because they can't be recorded, they can't use their dealer boards. So a lot of those types of aspects have needed to be reconsidered in terms of how that setup will work and how that control stack will work if people are working from home. So we have conducted a few audits, and we are actually just concluding on some of them around this. And some of the kind of technology controls we've looked at, I would say, are not specific to cloud or security per se, but mainly from a security perspective. I think it's mostly looking at things like the use of Zoom, how secure are confidential company calls, or how are the kind of data loss prevention controls working. Can someone just send a company confidential document out into the internet without being caught out by the DLP alerts? So those are the types of kind of checks we've looked at as part of that particular COVID related audit, and I think that generally summarizes how we would look at any audit. We would look at what are the top risks for a particular area, and then structure our audit according to that. I hope that clarifies, Paul. But thank you for that.
Paul has just mentioned that most of the home Wi-Fi transmits outside of the building because you can't just put a bubble on the end of your window, so that's unfortunately for the spoofing or some kind of malicious activities is mostly possible. So he's saying that it's a total madness. So that's I think hopefully
I agree, and I think all you can do is then in those instances put detective controls around monitoring and around more kind of it does put a strain on the technology teams and the IT security teams in some ways. But it becomes more detective rather than preventative, because the preventative is that you don't even use home Wi-Fi. You're always in the confines of the building, which has kind of specific connectivity which is already approved and tested. So I think that is the kind of general point, which is there's more that you can do on the detective side in those instances rather than the preventative checks.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can take it, Paul, maybe a little bit later because we have a quick, let's say, presentation. We have some more things to do and there are more questions. So if you do not mind, Paul, we will just discuss it after the presentation in the Q&A, and I will let you to speak up and present you. But there is one more question about how do you determine the scope of your audit and when do you inform the client? So is there anything like you could just quickly answer this one?
Yeah, I think, the third line of defense is what the internal audit function is called. And, we are very much part and parcel of, the overall risk management framework for an organization. So how we would, make sure that we're plugged into all of the key governance forums. Our audit plans are very much agreed. We're working in partnership with the business to actually make sure that we are covering the right audits, we are focusing our attention on the key areas. When it comes to the actual kind of the scope of the work as well, we work very much in conjunction with the business, who would then sometimes come to us to say, can you please do an audit of this particular area, because I wanted you to do a deep dive. Because I think there's quite a bit of risk here. So it depends on, so we work very much in conjunction with the business. We're also, kind of plugged into a lot of industry forums. So we are seeing, kind of what is going on in the industry in terms of heightened risks or things that we want to focus on. There could also be the other aspect about, maybe the board asks us to do a particular area. or the regulator asks us to do a particular deep dive of a specific area. So it depends. It comes from different directions, and that's why it's very important for internal audit to be plugged in and going along this kind of any big transformation program or embedded into the governance structures, even including the risk committees and all of those things. It's very much important to have internal audit being taken along that journey as well.
Thank you. And you're having more questions to go on. So do you want me to take them, or do you prefer to do that later?
Let's do them later, Susanna, because I do want to go to the next slide as well, and I do want to cover a few more things on this particular topic.
Absolutely.
So I think when it comes to legal and compliance risks, now, some of the examples I will cite here are potentially, mainly kind of leaning towards the financial services industry, but some of these legal and compliance risks are quite generic and can also be applied to most other industries as well. For example, there's the data prevention regulation for the GDPR, there's the HIPAA, which is for health information, and also, any of the other specific, kind of risks around third-party outsourcing is covered by quite a few regulations now. There's a European Banking Authority, which has produced a guidance paper around outsourcing, and also FCA guidance as well for outsourcing to the cloud. So there's quite a few, kind of rules and regulations that typically organizations need to comply with. And there could also be, the fact that data is now not sitting within the organization's premises, but it is being taken outside. Like I mentioned before, the cloud hosting location could be in any jurisdiction, any part of the world. And maybe that jurisdiction is not a permitted region for that particular organization. So if a company operates quite heavily in Switzerland or in Japan, they are under quite stringent secrecy laws as well. So where data cannot actually leave that jurisdiction. Another consideration from a legal and compliance perspective is that CSPs are usually multi-tenanted and they are sharing their resources with many other customers. In the event of something like a law enforcement or a legal activity, civil legal activity, there could be an instance where you need to seize or examine the data on a physical disk, but that disk is actually, it's also got data of some other customers as well, so it may expose the data of multiple customers. The other, aspect of compliance risk is around IT licensing requirements and making sure that when customers are moving their software over to cloud provider, to also then take into consideration some of these IT licensing requirements as well. In terms of people risks, I think this is something that companies don't sufficiently acknowledge, that these transformations actually typically focus on technology rather than the human element, and it's more of an afterthought from a skills and training perspective. Now, I mentioned before that it touches on every part of the organization. Cloud transformation actually it brings about new ways of working, including the understanding of DevSecOps frameworks, the continuous kind of learning around the new tool sets that need to be used. It is quite a big people risk, and there's usually generally a fear of the unknown. The skill sets, it is can be a big gap to bridge. So all of these are quite significant people risks that need to be closely managed. When it comes to the operational risks, now a big challenge that organizations are actually facing now is that they are managing complex application estates, which are made up of a combination of applications hosted on premises, on multiple clouds. Sometimes they could range from like up to 3 or 4 cloud deployments with different providers, combination of public and private clouds as well. So enterprise IT have to actually manage this complicated stack. Plus, they should make sure that they continue to support business critical services and making sure that they maintain the availability of these systems as well. So it is a operationally it's quite a mammoth task for technology teams to be managing this entire undertaking. I think lastly, I think I would like to talk about the application migration risks, which when it comes to application migrations, not all of them, not all of the systems are actually even cloud ready. They could be running on legacy infrastructure, so they may need quite a bit of refactoring and redesigning to make it run in the cloud. Typical developers have become used to working with programming languages like Java, .NET, I used to be a Java developer. I don't think I was a very good one, but I think from it's very easy to then fall into a very traditional kind of development technique. And it may be challenging for some developers to actually learn to use some of these new tool sets and application services which the cloud is providing, which could seem unfamiliar without that kind of right level of training to bridge that skill gap. When it comes to controls, now this is kind of bread and butter for internal audit functions and also IT risk and IT security functions. I would just, before I go into a little bit of detail, I would say that control should always be implemented proportional to the likelihood of the risk happening and also the impact of that risk which is specific to the organization. So it doesn't mean that you should always gold plate controls. It could be that for the size and scale of that particular organization's activities, it's okay to just have quite a rudimentary control on a spreadsheet. I think that is a key point to make there. But when it comes to countermeasures, it is important to implement multiple layers of defense against any risk. Equally, for a control that directly addresses a risk, there should be an additional control to catch the failure of the first control. Now, in audit speak, what we call these are compensating controls, which then help to create like a web of defense to ensure that if the initial control fails, then or maybe difficulty in due to some sort of an attack, then that compensating control kicks in and is still able to then mitigate the overall risk. So when we conduct audits, we are always looking for not just one control, but a web of controls to make sure that overall is that risk mitigated or not. And like I said before, we don't expect to see gold-plated controls every single time. We would then have to consider the nature, size, scale, complexity of that particular activity, and then see if that control is proportional to that as well.
And just question on that, Sri, before you continue with that. From your experience, right, like most of the controls in place and most of the activities which you take and decide how to mitigate the risk must come through some approval process with your board or with your, key stakeholders or something like that. Would you have any tips and tricks from your experience? What works, how to communicate, for example, that actually the controls can be put in place or you have the justification for them? Would you share a couple or something quick with you?
Yeah, I would say, just generally, I would expect any organization to have some kind of a formal risk management framework in place to make sure that there's some way of continuously identifying, detecting, and preventing any type of risk. In these formal governance structures, also, I mentioned the risk committee. There would be, kind of similar constructs in different industries and different, organizations. But I would expect also involvement from all the three lines of defense. Typically, what happens in public companies, for example, is there's a lot of reliance on there's quite a bit of independent assurance which needs to be provided for SOX controls. So all of these controls, will need to also be reviewed by the risk committee. Or there is also, kind of a periodic reassessment of these controls because especially in the technology organizations, the technology controls can be so, fast moving and fast paced that you can't expect to, have a stagnant control which remains the same forever. So it is important to, periodically retest and re-look at those and check, is that control still fit for purpose and mitigating the risk that we are trying to mitigate. So I think it's important to, kind of almost have it from different angles. So one is the first line, independently, like not independently, but as, checking the control operation as they go along when they are implementing these in the system. In some other places, there could be like automated regression tests that only look at the control stack to make sure that they're always continuously running in the background. And this is, I'm talking about technology systems and application systems which have key controls which are built into them. In some other, and then in the second line, usually in the risk functions, there again is, something called maybe a risk and control assessment that they would do on an ongoing basis. And every organization has different, kind of material risks that they want to monitor and track for. And some of these controls then become inputs into that. And there should also be then governance and escalation. If they are, say, outside of risk appetite and some of those controls don't work, they need funding. All of that then needs to be escalated through to the governance forums to make sure that there is that kind of oversight from the, from the senior management all the way to the control operators. So that, it then brings about a culture of controls in the organization. So I would say expecting involvement from all three lines of defense and also having a formal governance framework definitely helps with these control implementations.
Thank you.
So I think when this is quite a busy slide, but I think what I would like to do is just take you through some of the key examples of some of the controls I would expect to see, in relation to each of those key risks that I highlighted in the slide before. When it comes to governance and third-party oversight, alignment to the business strategy, the senior management oversight through formal governance structure, having a formal risk management framework, all of that is quite critical. And then having oversight over what decisions are being made in terms of which applications are going to move to cloud, any risks that are coming up as they are migrating applications or refactoring them. All of these then need to then be escalated to these governance forums. In terms of the, kind of third-party outsourcing risks, now there are quite a few angles on this one, especially because, like I said before, some organizations could have multiple third parties that are supporting on this cloud transformation program. And it is important to have a clear, demarcation of responsibilities between the cloud service provider and the cloud service consumer. And typically there's something called a shared responsibility matrix, which the cloud service provider then draws up. And it clearly outlines the responsibilities of who does what, who's responsible for patching, who's responsible for, security controls, user identity access management controls. So that responsibility matrix then makes it quite clear in terms of who does what, and also then accountability for those as well. In terms of, because there is quite a bit of third-party outsourcing risk, the contractual agreement with the cloud service provider has to contain the right legal clauses and should also then specify key SLAs with the cloud service provider relating to uptime. It could be relating to, security, patching, resolution of defects, vulnerabilities. All of this should be nicely laid out in the contract between the organization and the cloud service provider. The consumer organization should also have third-party oversight framework to be able to continuously monitor the CSPs and whether they meet the SLAs or not. And these SLAs again should be re-reviewed and on a periodic basis to make sure is this even the right set of metrics and KPIs that we want to hold the CSPs accountable for. In terms of the financial services industry, again, I mentioned before the EBA outsourcing guidelines and also the FCA's guidelines for outsourcing cloud, related services. It's quite detailed, and it expects organizations to have something called an exit strategy as well, through the use of alternative, service providers, And this exit strategy is to help the organization in the event that maybe the CSP is no longer willing or is capable of providing that particular agreed service. Maybe they've been triggered, it's been triggered by a bankruptcy or a need to restructure that particular business. So it's quite important, and the regulators are expecting all the banks to draw up an exit strategy on how they would come out of that CSP if need be. So those would be some of the key controls around governance and third-party oversight. Again, this is not the full list. There's, I could go on and on for the whole time just talking about those. In terms of SDLC and DevSecOps, now this is something that DevSecOps is a new way of working for some people. And it requires information security, application development, IT operations teams to work collaboratively while automating the deployment of software and infrastructure changes, making the entire software lifecycle faster from a code commit to all the way to a production deployment. It is a new way of working for IT, and it requires new skills to be learned. The end goal of the end goal is actually having frequent software deployments, so that it becomes so routine that it's a non-event, as opposed to one big disruptive major rollout, which could bring down the entire business service. So due to this collaboration and the use of open source reusable code libraries and standardized automated tests, especially in the DevSecOps world, managing and controlling access to these code repositories and then segmenting code trees by developer role is quite an important aspect to make sure that we've got the integrity of the software code is maintained. The other aspect is about monitoring for any anomalous activity. Would you expect that particular application developer to be touching this particular Terraform script? So all of those types of things I think need to be monitored for, and usually there would be a central kind of SOC, Securities Operations Center, which is then looking for these types of anomalous activities. Also, it's important to implement policies and have an overall framework as well on how do you expect application developers, what are the key controls around SDLC when it comes to DevOps, around things like how are the scripts, how is the integrity of those automated testing scripts managed, how is it controlled? Who can make changes to those automated testing scripts for security, for static code analysis, for unit testing. So maintaining the integrity of those scripts is quite important. Through access, through controlling access, and also making sure that it is then divided in a kind of logical way that people can't, kind of make changes to each other's areas or applications. The other thing which is quite important is to actually include continuous security reviews as part of every agile sprint, and then having specific security related automated testing, which is then built into every single change. And it just helps, to not allow for security to almost be like an afterthought. It is then designed and built into the system as it's being deployed. Then when it comes to cloud security, I think automating as much as possible relating to security controls is the way to go on this, because it can be quite complex, and I think it's important to then have some kind of a baseline image, which then the organization decides which are my kind of key most vulnerable points that I want to then control. And then making sure that as part of the security testing, but also as part of that baseline image, there are controls that detects malware, encrypts data, configures log files, registers new machines into the configuration management system. So there's a lot that you can do with automation of those, controls into the deployment process and into the scripts for the application. I think, like I mentioned before, I think deploying and auditing security configurations such as security groups, network ACL, firewall security for IaaS or access rules for SaaS, it helps to design a secure architecture from the onset. Other factors would be using mainstream multi-factor authentication mechanisms for authentication to establish the user's identity, using federated identity management model, which allows for generation of tokens from the for authentication in one domain. Maybe the application is the user signing on from on-prem, and the consumption of those tokens for authorization is in another domain, because some of the bit of the application is then residing in the cloud domain. So using that federated identity management model then helps with that. The other bit is around conducting SDLC security testing to ensure that any application authenticators such as passwords, PINs, digital certificates, all of that is then protected, and making sure that nobody then is able to then change or modify that particular aspect of security. The other thing that I mentioned is around threat monitoring, and the first point of that is threat modeling, around what should be the threats that should be monitored for. And the second bit is around then someone, maybe typically a security operations center, who then look at those anomalous activities, maintain, reviews the flow of data from on-prem to the cloud, and then making sure that they also define use cases which are pertinent to the key threats that they think are most important for them to monitor for. And also then having some kind of proactive alerting on any security policy violations, anomalous behavior, and then responding adequately to those incidents as well. So those would be some of the kind of high level security related controls that I would expect. Again, this is not a very detailed presentation, so I've kept it quite high level. But I'm sure there are myriads of controls that you could expect around just specifically around security. When it comes to cloud data privacy and protection, now with the rising number of data breaches and increased emphasis on data privacy regulations such as PSD2, GDPR, in the EU, US, globally, there's an expectation that multiple layers of controls are implemented to protect these crown jewels. The primary control against unauthorized access, I would mainly say for data, it has to be protected when it's in rest, when it's in motion, and when it's in use. So when I talk about data and rest, what I would expect as the key control for that is any type of encryption, which helps ensure confidentiality. Now, data backups of the encrypted keys is something that actually is something that maybe people don't remember as an important control. But what happens if you actually lose the encrypted information because you don't have your keys to access that encrypted information? So I think it's important to then back up those encryption keys as well when it comes to data and rest. For data in motion, the network can be actually then segregated, into multiple zones, physically and logically, maybe through the use of technologies such as VLANs. The resulting traffic separation almost acts like a control for confidentiality and integrity of that data in motion. So you're covered for data in rest by encryption, you're covered for data in motion through segregation of traffic. And then for data and use, it does require access controls with granularity that is relevant for the data at risk. It could be that the applications have specific APIs that need to be protected, and these can be done through the use of digital signatures or encryption where necessary. And then access rights should also be then according to a need to know basis, making sure that users don't have anything additional that they don't need access to. So that is what I would typically expect for data and use. Also, kind of having those kind of multiple layers of control. So maybe doing tokenization or obfuscation of data masking for maybe critical or secret information that nobody should have access to. Would be an additional kind of protection layer over and above the controls that we spoke about. And then lastly, I think there should really be some kind of data loss prevention monitoring as well. It could also, there could be egress filtering or data activity monitoring. And these then act as additional layers of protection for that data. Any questions before I go on to the last two, and then we can do quick wrap up and takeaways?
There are so many questions. We do have around 5 questions so far, but I will keep it till the end, except one, because you have touched on the formal threat modeling, and Peter Glock actually asked, where would you see a formal threat modeling program for in? So the question is, where would you see a formal threat modeling program for in, which you have covered a little bit about the threat modeling. But I think what the question is more about where does it fit in and how can you like elaborate. So if you want to just maybe generally repeat the formal threat, and if Peter has any more questions, we can cover it after the last slide, because we are kind of running a little bit out of the time free. So many information you're sharing us. So I hope that people can hang on for some bits, but if you can just maybe just comment on the formal threat and positioning in the controls, and how do you foresee that, or what is the situation?
Yeah, I think, when it comes to threat modeling, it's important to then, almost do that at the design level. So when you are designing the system, or when you're designing the, kind of which applications migrate to cloud, which ones don't, you should really be thinking of, threats at that point, and then almost building up your use cases on which, and then tweaking them as you go along. It typically then goes through quite a bit of, kind of analysis stage of which ones are the key threats that I want to, monitor for. And then you have to then do the modeling of if I then, just pretend like this threat is actually realized, then what types of data points will I need to use? So there's quite a bit of testing that needs to be done before that use case is actually then even productionized. So a lot of, kind of analysis, kind of almost like modeling it in a test environment before it then gets productionized. And then again, there could be different threat vectors that you want to then model for and monitor for. But I would say, if at least the key ones would be around, monitoring for loss of data, because that is your crown jewel. Or it could be something around, critical applications that are crisis causing, that are servicing crisis causing business processes. So I think those would be, kind of almost like the way I would structure how you would think of vulnerability management and threat modeling.
Okay, excellent. I think we do have another 5-6 questions which will come after. So I will let you finish your slides, and then we can dig into with the people in the more discussions.
All right, thank you. So in terms of the reliability and availability, now I think a lot of people assume that the cloud is, of course, going to be much more reliable than in-house applications and in-house managed infrastructure, and I think that's true to most. In most ways, I think it's important now also because there are many of these types of applications that are supporting business critical services, and many regulators in the financial services industry, the EBA and the FCA guidelines, they do now expect organizations to ensure recoverability of critical business processes or crisis causing systemic services, as opposed to just focusing on IT recoverability. So that is a kind of a different angle that people are coming from, because they don't really just care about IT disaster recovery. Yeah, I have a plan, I've tested it, it works. You flip over from primary to secondary. Yeah, all good to go. They do want to actually then talk about how sure are you that you can continue business services the way it is, the way kind of customers are used to. And that then needs to be baked into your whole design of the application in terms of reliability of the applications deployed to cloud. First, you have to identify which are those critical components that are required to ensure business continuity. The other one is around periodic testing of recovery capabilities, not just of the application stack, but also of the underlying infrastructure as well. So the full technology stack, including some of the tools and services which are provided by the cloud service provider themselves. So how do you know that Kubernetes would work, or how would you know that your IAM that is provided by the cloud service provider can actually come back up and running as well, because these are critical tools and services that then the application relies on. Also then ensuring that there are contractually agreed availability SLAs and uptime requirements. Those are agreed with the CSP as well. And then implementing redundancy, but not just having just more than one of something of the same component, but actually also having isolation of those components as well, just to make sure that if it just protects from a big like a disaster, like an earthquake or floods or something. How do you know that the system components in one hosting location is going to be safe if it's in the same geography? So designing those kind of redundancy and isolations for availability zones in the cloud, tool chains provided by the CSP, as well as the isolation of the whole cloud hosting location. Those are some of the kind of important checks and almost design considerations, I would say, in the overall system architecture of any application which is migrating to cloud. I think we touched on, kind of the regulatory compliance area quite a bit, in all of the previous points. I think one thing that I would say is, having in engaging with legal and compliance, because they are the, gurus on, any kind of jurisdictional or regulatory requirements. So engaging with them throughout, and and they will help navigate through the myriad of, kind of rules and regulations and standards that organizations have to comply with. And then the other thing is also then to ensure that these regulatory requirements are clearly documented, are articulated, and then also the status of compliance is monitored against that, and then maybe almost treating that as a part of the control implementation and the design of the cloud architecture. Because then that just helps in kind of compliance from day one, rather than again thinking of compliance, regulatory compliance, as an afterthought. And then having kind of proactive monitoring of any changes to the regulations. Usually this is something that the central legal and compliance teams do, but having that kind of checkpoint to see, I understand that EBA, guidelines said this in 2019. What does it say now? And then doing that on an ongoing basis, having those ongoing dialogues with legal and compliance, and maybe even potentially the regulators as well in some regard. So those are the kind of key controls that I would expect from a cloud migration perspective. It was a whirlwind, kind of whiz-stop tour around the whole thing, but I hope it was useful. I would just wrap up here to just say what should you really take away. One is, of course, we all know that cloud, unleashes multiple business benefits, opportunities for the organizations. However, this must be really balanced with also investing in careful governance, risk management, and appropriate control implementations from the onset. And the other thing is, it's probably a plug-in for all of my, friends in, friends doing the same thing. Make sure that you seek input and engage with IT risk, IT security, and IT audit colleagues throughout this cloud transformation journey, because this will just help enable cloud deployments to be used safely, simply, responsibly, and securely. I think that was it. So Susanna, if you want to then open it up for questions, I'm happy to take any. If you can unmute the audience, I would love. I feel like I'm doing a monologue for the past 1.5 hours, so I'm happy to take any questions from anyone. So you can even put
absolutely. So we do have around 7 questions. So what I would just start maybe with the first one from the Ranjan Bandari. How effective transparency and control in public cloud? Do we have any control over how data is stored, moved, and processed? Isn't this a pose issues related with GDPR? So literally about, do we have any control over how data are stored, moved, and processed across the cloud providing? And I will allow Ranjan, if he is still in, I will just allow him to speak. And I unmute him right now so he can discuss that with you. Okay, so I don't know if Ranjan is on or not, but I unmute him. So would you like to just answer the question?
Yeah, I would say, when it comes to GDPR compliance, a lot of the cloud providers now, the big cloud providers, they do, provide tools and, services that can allow for you to then check whether, how GDPR compliant are you. It's almost like something that you can check for in the management console or, at the high level. But that said, it's always good to then also use something like the SOC 1, SOC 2 reports for the cloud service provider. But mostly the controls that around data is usually the responsibility of the consuming organization. So if it's up to me to then make sure that I have enough controls around data in rest, data in motion, and data in use. So some of the examples that I mentioned before, very much apply and would then help in, kind of implementing those to be compliant with the rules of GDPR. But then I think it's also good to then do a sense check to see where else is my data going. Do I know what route it takes between my premises to my company's premises to the cloud hosting location. So I think so that there could be tools that I use to then view all of this almost like on a central dashboard. But this is something that is quite a pertinent topic, especially for anyone in the EU and globally, because like I said, data is a crown jewel, and it has to be really protected from any kind of loss or attack.
Okay, thank you. We are just running out of the time, so I don't know if it's gonna get disconnected. So I'm sorry if that does or not, but it looks like we survived the timeout. So that's a good one. I was like, oh my goodness, it's gonna go over. So hopefully we will not be disconnected. But I think you answered the question. Hopefully Rajan can comment on that. The next question is from Robert Olobo. How do you ensure business continuity measure properly taken care of for your business in the cloud? So how do you ensure business continuity measure properly taken care of for your business in cloud? And I will try to unmute Robert. If he wants to talk, he can talk. So far he's self-muted, but if you want to just elaborate, he's allowed to discuss with you. So how do you ensure the business continuity?
Yeah, I think, thank you for that question, Robert. I think it's important to highlight, for any organization to first of all understand what are those, business critical processes that, maybe is a crisis causing systemic process that always needs to be up and running. And it's, based on that, then that's almost like the, the starting point of, how do you first identify what are the key business processes, and then which are the applications that then support that particular business process. Now, sometimes what happens is that the trade booking application could be fine, but then the settlements application could fall over. So the feeds, from the trades don't go into the settlements world. So I think it's important to then also, understand the handoffs between one system and the other. And some of this, then the complexity then becomes that some of these applications may be on premises and some of these could be cloud hosted. So then actually then testing for it and making sure that end to end, I'm able to then recover and bring back a service is quite important to actually test out, to plan for, and also periodically then check, because these systems could continuously be changed. So I think end-to-end testing and making sure that there's a front to back plan, which then covers all of the tools, the critical tools that the application relies on. If that's something that like I mentioned before, some of these tools may be provided by the cloud service provider. So what is the kind of uptime requirements that they have agreed to? So if Google has said, I'm only going to provide 99% uptime for something like Kubernetes, is that even acceptable for your business risk appetite? So it's important to plan for that front to back dependency chart to see what are the key services, tools, applications that crisis causing service relies on, and then planning for it, testing for it, going back to the vendor to negotiate the SLAs, making sure that it's baked into the contract. All of these could be kind of then almost like a step-by-step process. But the first thing is to identify what are my key crisis causing services or business processes. I hope that answers your question.
I hope so too. If any comments, you can unmute yourself. Otherwise, we're going to jump on Marcellus Brown, who has 2 questions. So Marcellus, I'm unmuting you. You can unmute if you want to talk. And the question from Marcellus is, how does the organization cope with a data spill where someone inadvertently loses data to unauthorized customers of suppliers? So how does the organization cope with a data spill when someone inadvertently loses data to unauthorized customers or suppliers?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, the most of the organizations, they have, several classifications of data. So if you lose something that is not really, secret, confidential, private to the organization, if it's publicly, available information, maybe it's okay, but it's still important to then log it in the data loss prevention tool to say that this has been there's been an inadvertent data leakage for this particular point, logging it, and then making sure that it doesn't happen again. So some kind of monitoring around how many instances of these types of inadvertent data leaks have happened in the past. It does help in kind of building in any type of detective controls that you need. Or also then maybe it is that people need to be trained, or there's a lack of security awareness and user awareness. So it just gives you the capability to then understand where are those pinch points, or is something happening all the time, and then does it mean that we need to then build a control to monitor and prevent that from happening again. So, and the other thing would be, to then contact the customer, contacting potentially the regulator. There could be so many, aspects that need to be then managed by this IT security team to make sure that that whole data loss, that data breach is well managed, and then potentially it could also need to be escalated up to the board or the governance committees as a risk that then has been realized. I think it's about then having enough checkpoints to see that this doesn't reoccur, and also what needs to be done immediately to kind of either speak to the regulators or the board or the senior management teams. Having both those then help to then prevent that it doesn't happen again.
Yes, thank you for that. It's a data spill was as I saw it, was normally somebody through accident would spill data out to the wrong parties, and of course,
Yeah,
being out in the cloud with more and more providers involved, you've
yeah,
got more of a risk, and then you've got a problem when it happens, and how you sort of manage it, which I think you've pretty well covered. But
yeah,
it's it's probably need more processes and things with when you
yeah.
cloud back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, then going back to that shared responsibility matrix on, you should really have, procedures to say what should the cloud provider do in the event that they get access to, inadvertently get access to some data that they shouldn't really be accessing. What does the provider do, but also what escalations need to be in place? Does it then trigger an alert in the to the security operations center? What does the security operations center then do about it? How does it then resolve it in terms of that particular incident? But also then making sure that they then potentially build in some additional threat use cases to then monitor for that in the future. So I think it's about then planning for it not to happen again, but also then making sure that the incident is responded to properly at the point that it happens.
Thank you.
And I think, Marcellus, you have one more question there. So if you want to take it about the encryption keys, I will leave it up to you.
I was thinking that if you've got all your encrypted data, all sitting there all nicely, and you lose the keys, so you're in the frustrating position that you've got all your data encrypted, but there's no way you can access it, whether you can roll back somehow. I mean, I was at a data center when they had an incident where they lost the indexes on the disks. So all the data was on the disks, but it couldn't be accessed.
No, that's exactly why, I think I made that point when I was talking about encryption, that actually backup of encryption keys is also quite a critical control from, and that's something that we would then test for and look for when we are auditing encryption. Because, that's exactly right. These things happen, and, what would you do if you don't even know how to unencrypt that data? Sometimes we are the masters of our own destiny in terms of how we can build those controls and design those controls, and this almost becomes like a control design point on have you even thought of if this happens, then how would you then recover your data when it's all encrypted?
Yes, I think that's good what you say. I remember a problem I had with a laptop. It just said BitLocker error. Okay, so I went to the BitLocker site to get it unlocked, and of course the BitLocker site wasn't there at that address anymore. And then, then I went on a bit further, and then just found out it was the hard disk had gone completely. So you don't really want that when you've got thousands of users. Sort of a similar thing to that, where you have to roll back or something, or dig yourself out.
That's absolutely true. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcels. I'm muting you down, and we do have 4 more questions, so we will just try to go quickly. So the one of the quicker one: how do you audit the contractual and associated documents, from Sheila Keddy? So I will try to put Sheila, if she is up, if she wants to discuss. I think it's a lady. So yeah. So the question is, how do you audit the contractual and associated document? And Sheila Keddy is possible to talk if you want to.
Thank you. Yes, I've just.
Hi, Sheila. Yeah, go ahead. I can hear you.
I think you muted yourself back, Sheila, so you can unmute. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Looking, for example, at the Amazon Web Services information.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem completely there seem to be contradictions. It says in one place that the client owns the data, which is correct. I'm thinking in personal information context,
Yeah.
and that they will never access it without consent. It also says we'll store it only where you tell us to store it. And then when I look at other bits, it says, for example, unless it's necessary for our services, which is like a little get out clause. And then there's another one about them responding to legally binding requests for information.
Yeah.
And what would worry me would be which countries' laws are they applying for these?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think on the contract management, how do we audit that? Of course, we've got a specialist team I'm just speaking for NatWest Markets, NatWest Group. We've got a central kind of a team that only looks at supply chain risks and looking at contracts, looking at the making sure that the right clauses are in there. But absolutely, Sheila, I think one of the things that we look at is on these types of contradicting statements in the contract, because sometimes what happens is that the contractual kind of negotiations are quite long drawn out, and by the time it gets to the actual paperwork, it's almost like, yeah, let's just get it done, and we'll just sign up to whatever the big providers are giving. But I think in terms of some of the bits around the responding to the legally binding requests to access data, then yes, yeah, if there is some kind of a criminal proceedings and they need to access the data on a physical disk, then yes, they should be able to access that. I think the thing to note would be they should be able to, Amazon in that instance should be able to access that information, but before they access it, they should be letting the provider know, the consumer know, and also if there's any other impacted customers, maybe that physical disk has data from several other customers that are using the same where the resource is being shared. So it is about getting consent, and this is something that GDPR also asks for. You have to get consent from the data owner before you then are able to access that bit of information. And yeah, in some kind of critical scenarios or events, it may be that they need to then access that at the drop of a button, but then you do need consent from the data owner before that happens. In the other thing about clients owning data, that is absolutely, I think even the regulators, their expectation is that to make sure that the customers don't lose their own accountability of data which they manage, and they are supposed to be responsible for what controls they put in. So even things like encryption key management, the keys to accessing that data typically is then controlled by the consuming organization rather than the cloud service provider. But it is important to then look at these, kind of contradicting things. But of course, it's not a get out clause, I would say, but it is, there will always be these, kind of unforeseen circumstances or events where you just need to get that data, and it's really important. And the lawyers are, after this one criminal who needs, and you need to get that data. So of course there should be, events where they should be able to access that data, but it needs to be consensual, and it needs to get approval before they then access it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's in my experience, the business side tends to think that because an organization is used by a lot of people, what's in the contracts doesn't need to be checked.
No, yeah, that's exactly why we, in NatWest Group, many of these cloud service providers are what we call as material outsource arrangements. So we have, to then make sure that the contracts are right, that they've kind of done all the right things with the regulators. it got exit strategies in place. So all of those things around contractual, and also maybe even things as simple as the right to audit clause. Sometimes, my audit function can't actually then even go and visit, of course, a data center that hosts the cloud for Amazon Web Services. So there could be some things where we then look at the SOC 1 and SOC 2 reports to then get comfort that actually it's okay, because from the SOC 1, SOC 2 reports, I can see that physical access security for the data center is okay, and I don't need to worry about that. So I think that right to audit clause is another key one. So there's a few of these, kind of key clauses that our central kind of audit team that looks at these contracts look out for.
Yeah, that's good. The other thing I look for is where the contract places obligations on the client. And again, clients not noticing these because they're just focusing on what's of interest to them. So to point to them, actually, according to this contract, we have to have some things in place.
Yeah.
So thank you, because I absolutely agree with you.
Thanks, Sheila. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Sheila. So we do have a next question from Steve Sand. So if Steve wants to, I'm gonna unmute him and he can discuss that with you. And his question is related: are financial services sector comfortable to rely on CSP provided encryption at rest technology, key generation, HSMC, and would they always prefer to run this independently, if you know?
Yeah, I think again that depends on how big the financial services company is. It may be that it's a small kind of challenger bank that wants to focus on maybe that they're not that worried about what types of applications they're putting on the cloud. So it really depends on what the organization's kind of risk appetite is, what their risk tolerance is, and what they think is whether this is something that is worth investing in. For some small banks, it may be absolutely okay to have something that is an encryption tool which is provided and managed by the CSP, like the HSMC that you mentioned. So it completely depends on the kind of the risk tolerance of that particular organization. So I wouldn't want to generalize there, but again, when we audit these these controls, always we think about is that proportional to the risk that it poses. So I think I mentioned before that in some cases a rudimentary spreadsheet just doing checking for a particular activity is absolutely okay. So I think from an audit perspective, we also try to be a little bit commercial. We don't want to always ask for the gold-plated, most expensive control to be implemented. I think that is where audit can add value a bit in terms of thinking commercially, thinking about, is that really going to be the most critical thing for that organization to invest and put their money on? Because some of these encryption tools which they need to manage are quite expensive, and also it needs a team to run it. It can be quite challenging for teams that only have a technology function of people. So you have to think about proportionality of the risk that particular need poses, and then think about how the control should be designed.
That's a great answer. Thanks very much, Sri. I was just interested in whether there were any kind of minimum standards imposed by the FCA or the PRA or the EBA or any of these regulatory bodies across the banking sector for encryption.
Yeah, they do, Steve. They do actually mention that there should be encryption in use, in rest, and in motion, but they don't necessarily talk about what type of tool you need to implement or anything like that. That's completely left to the judgment of the organization.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Steve. And we have two quick questions. The one from Olu Odeni. So I'm just unmuting Olu if he wants to discuss with you. His question is, does your organization have an overall risk and security posture dashboard or similar?
Yeah, thanks for the the session tonight. I really enjoyed that, and as a NatWest customer, I'm happy to know that my assets are well protected and well audited. They mentioned that there's lots of things going on in terms of the compliance side of things, and are we still compliant, etc., and so on, and all the DevSecOps, etc., and so on. And I relate to all of that. So I just wondered whether or not you've got some way of finding out where you're at from a posture, security, or a compliance posture at any one time. I mean, there's a lot going on. So how do you manage that?
Yeah, so we've got quite a well-defined kind of IT security framework in the organization. Nothing that we would audit that, but then this is completely owned and managed by the technology function themselves. But that said, they do a lot in terms of monitoring where their security posture is compared to their peers in the industry, etc. And if there's any kind of even when it comes to just looking at understanding what the threats are, what is the kind of industry saying in terms of these are the key top vulnerabilities that are coming up. There's a lot of kind of collaboration between organizations on that front, I would say, and a lot of industry bodies around just making sure that you're comparing notes between one bank to the next. So I think overall, security posture is something that yes, the organization is very much monitoring, and in fact, this is something that the accountability of this also goes all the way up to the CEO, and we've in the financial services. I don't know whether you know, there is quite a bit of there's a significant management function, SMF, and it's basically the senior management regime, and it gives accountability for key people to be responsible for key activities to make sure that who is the person who is then responsible for making sure that these controls and the risks are managed properly. So I think when it comes to SMF responsibilities, one of the important things for them is also to then monitor for these for the overall posture of the organization when it comes to something as important as cybersecurity, especially because there is customers' data being potentially sent on the cloud. They need to be kind of completely cognizant of what those threats are, and it goes up all the way to the top. So in our instance, it's CEO -1 that then is the SMF for technology.
Okay, no, thank you very much. And I sent you a LinkedIn request, so look out for it, Olu.
Thanks, Olu.
And we have last question from Anonymous, and just wanted to elaborate. Can you please give some examples of licensing risks?
Yeah, I would say, some of the licensing risks, just generally, if you're deciding to put your application, your software and your, the underlying kind of databases over to cloud, there may be, some kind of considerations around, how those licenses are, managed in terms of how do you some licenses may it may be a per CPU usage model, or it could be a per user model. How do you then track and monitor that in terms of how many licenses are you using, how many are in active use at the same time? And also in terms of some of this, when you start thinking about how many virtual machines are potentially being run in the cloud, this could then very much kind of blow out of proportion in terms of licensing costs. So it's quite important to then have some kind of a way to monitor what those total licensing requirements are, understanding where your kind of baseline is, from how much is the kind of maximum you can spend on licenses, licensing costs, and then putting some kind of caps in terms of usage when it comes to running the same software multiple times in the cloud environment. So I think that is the kind of angle from a licensing requirements, more from how can you manage the costs of licensing, rather than kind of, and also of course then making sure that you are then paying for every license you're using, because that again is one of those risks that is very usually kind of overseen and not really thought of very well.
Okay. So because we don't have nobody to talk to, I think that was the last question. So I just wanted to take this opportunity and thank you so much for your time. And I know we ran over, and thank for all the attendees who stay with us. So I just wanted to say big thank you, Shri. It has been an honor to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, and really, I enjoyed this. I would have liked to have a live audience with live interaction where I can see people's faces, but we have to make do with what we've got in this situation.
Absolutely, and I believe you are not for the last time in the IRMA event, so we will try to plan something when the situation will be better. So I just wanted to say thank you one more time to all the attendees. Wish you all the best, and hopefully you keep safe, and soon we will be again able to meet. So thank you so much, and I will be closing the recording. If anybody want to discuss, I'm gonna just allow discussions. Otherwise, you are just free to leave at your convenience. Thank you so much.